there's a lot to talk about here. We also did a previous episode on superforecasting, and I think my views were slightly less well formed when we talked about that. That was sort of an initial foray into that. But if people are interested, they can go back and listen to that. Maybe I'll just start out by saying at a high level, I'm just sort of skeptical that the super forecasting stuff is as accurate as people are making it out to be. And there's been some nice recent articles written by people who were initially interested in super forecasting and very bullish on it. Wait, bullish on it? Is that the right one? I always forget. Yeah. Just saying that some of Tetlock's original statistics were not as robust as someone would have liked them to be.
We'll link to that as well.
Yeah. So I'll quote some stuff for that. So anyway, my general critique is, which we can get more into, is that I'm just sort of skeptical that they're as accurate as claimed. So I think a good way to maybe express my skepticism is that I think super forecasting is less a story of that there's a special class of people who can see into the future and pull these magical numbers out of thin air that describe the future, and more a story of, if you think carefully about the world, read widely, and aren't dogmatic, then you can see the world more clearly than people who are pundits and who are incentivized to say, for instance, inflammatory things on the news to get views. So if you compare a class of people who are generally truth-seeking about the world versus a class of people who just have other incentives at play because they need to keep their job on cable news, or they, trying to keep their Substack audience up by saying provocative things, then I don't. And I think that's actually, that second class of people is most people when it comes to commenting on the future. And so that sort of just willingness or desire to see the world clearly translates a little bit. So mostly it translates into just being a little bit less biased in your views. That in turn translates a little bit into better prediction. And that's not a huge surprise because the world it's not totally unpredictable. The world's not totally chaotic in some sense. So it's not surprising that you can find certain patterns and regularities that help you project things in the future. And if you doubt that, then just examine your own behavior day to day, right? There's a lot of things you're taking for granted about tomorrow and assumptions you're making about the next week and the week after based on how the world is today. And so it's not surprising that people who are just thinking carefully about the world can sort of pick up on some of those regularities. I think there's a huge limit to how far that sort of thing can go. And there's a huge limit to like how precise you can be in your numbers. And then there's also issues about like how they're measuring these things, et cetera. But that's my general current take on super forecasting and stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that Scott Alexander in his review of Tetlock's book made the same point, that super forecasters, I quoted him in either a blog post or in a podcast episode. Super forecasters are just people who don't hold too strongly to their views, are willing to change their mind when new evidence comes in. Importantly, they aren't people who ever use Bayes' theorem, which is something that I would love to ask Scott. When's the last time you actually used Bayes' theorem to do anything of consequence, to make any sort of decision? But that's a secondary point. And I would decently be willing to bet, I'd be curious to see the results of this at least, that I would say that all of the readers of Scott's blog would probably be categorized as super forecasters if they took the time to do the giant freaking list of like scorecard predictions that Scott does. I imagine that when people hear the word super forecaster, they think about other brilliant prophets that can see into the future probabilistically further than the person reading the word super forecaster can. But I can't say for sure, but I would be interested to see the results, and I would bet a small amount of money that all of the commenters, all of the people who read Scott's blog would do roughly better than average, because when Tetlock does these tests, he just gets a random sample from the population, right? And in the population, there's going to be people who, just go based on the last thing that they read in the news. And but you're already filtering for like a decently high intelligence people who read long form essays and blogs. And so most people who are reading this probably themselves are super forecasters, I would be willing to say.
And just changing the incentives is big there, right? Going from like news pundit to being incentivized to think carefully about the future. That does a lot of work for you already. Sorry.
The other thing is that Tetlock says at the end of his book in the appendix that any forecast greater than like 10 years is just delusional and you should not even attempt it. There was a survey effective altruism forum post about how calibrated people are when they go out into the future. I think I had to issue a correction based on what I said to Nick Anyos, and I don't remember how incorrect I characterized it in that episode, but without giving super precise numbers, it was something like the calibration starts to taper off pretty quickly after like a couple year horizon. So the super forecasting thing doesn't go too far into the future. Scott didn't talk about Brier scores here, but there's an interesting thing about Brier scores that we didn't talk about in the last episode that that I want to mention that I picked up somewhere on the internet, which is that, okay, so if you're Metaculus, so let me just attack Metaculus a little bit. And we should say to the listeners, so Metaculus was started by a grant from Scott Alexander. So Scott is very personally invested in the success of Metaculus, which I think is relevant information because he talks about it a lot. So Metaculus will often talk about how good their Brier score is. Brier score of like 0.17 or something. So now let's imagine we make a copy of Metaculus. So you and I start our own super forecasting platform, and we take all of Metaculus's questions, and we take the years that the predictions are made, and we just knock off 2 years from it. So if instead of super forecasting or super intelligence being created in 2030, it's 2028 or something. All the questions get proportionally easier, and our Brier score will go down. So we can change the Brier score arbitrarily depending on how difficult or easy the questions are. So if all the questions are essentially 50-50 coin flips, like are we going to terraform Mars by 2300? Then the best you could possibly do, a super forecaster doing the best they could do would be 50% across the board. So the more you move the questions to be all 50% questions, the more your Brier score will just naturally go up. And the more you move your questions to will the sun rise tomorrow, the Brier score will go down. So when you get,
we should say the Brier score going down is good.
Is good. Good. Yeah.
So low Brier score is what, like a Brier score of 0 would be perfectly calibrated.
Yeah. So when you get a number like 0.17 or whatever Metaculus is saying their Brier score is, they want to say, well, this is great because we're beating 0.25. So 0.25 would be if you just do random guessing. But there's no way to know if that is a function of how difficult the questions are. And you could arbitrarily make your Brier score higher or lower based on asking easier or harder questions. And that is very important because the Brier score is like seen as one of the major things that are why people trust super forecasters in the first place. I'm realizing that this isn't addressing Scott's major points, so we have to go through those as well. But I just want to comment that there's so much just kind of like sneaky things happening when people talk about super forecasters that give a very misleading impression. And if it's true, like the thing that would change my mind immediately is like a news article that says like companies' profits skyrocket upon hiring of a super forecasting team. Have never seen such a thing, and I don't expect to. And there's a reason that hedge funds don't really use super forecasters very much. And so I imagine that there is some benefit to hiring this Eastern European naming forecasting company, who I won't even attempt to pronounce. But I imagine the benefit is that you just get a bunch of like thoughtful people coming into your building and then talking through certain issues and going through the reasoning process and just helping you make a decision based on just being thoughtful, intelligent folks. But there's no magic solution here that's going to give you the right answer.
Okay, yeah, nice. So yeah, okay, there's a lot here. First, maybe I'll just defend us by saying I think it is important to talk about this because this is often how the defense is cashed out, right? It's like, okay, all these philosophical arguments aside, there's such a thing as super forecasting, and what the hell are they doing? Like, how are they so successful if this subjective probability on crazy one-off events is not meaningful or valuable? Like, what's going on here? So I think just to defend our obsession with this for a second, it is important to grapple with exactly what's going on here. So you brought up a number of nice points. The first, which I just want to echo, is that so Scott says that Sam Matsvetsky or whatever is employed in a number of places, but contrary to his usual style, I think only provides one link.
Yeah.
Like he just says they're employed by a bunch of stuff. I'm a little skeptical of this. So like I did a deep dive on the Good Judgment project, which is a different super forecasting project.
Well, that's Tetlocks.
Tetlocks, yeah, exactly. And his whole thing, he's changed his research focus to like helping super forecasting and getting it into the public eye and like having it be used by.
No, he's doing like business consulting and stuff, right? Like,
yeah, but like trying to get it used by like governments and businesses and stuff. Like this is like the role of the good judgment. Like they can be hired, they'll send people in there to help you. And if you go to like their success stories, like who they've worked with, there's just not that much there. And you would expect that if you've ever been on a project where this is a bit of a cheap shot, but if you've ever taken part in some sort of effort and you've like built a website for yourselves or something, and you're trying to make yourself look quite legitimate, and you'll list some of the stuff that you've done, but you don't quite have enough, but like there's certain tactics you can use to try and like make it seem like you've done more than you can. It's just their website reeks of that to me. Like I can't.
Hilarious. That's great.
So this is a total cheap shot, but like I would just recommend going to the Good Judgment Project website and looking at like testimonials or something, and you'll see what I mean. It's just a little bit sketchy.
Just like if it's true, which he says in one of his bullets that all super forecasting organizations will converge on the same number, then you would expect him to not talk about the only one good one, Smearty Vacky, or whatever it's called. Like, where's the Good Judgment Project? Why aren't they leading the board? Or why aren't they all equal if they're all going to give you the same numbers? They should be exactly the same if it was the case that they'll just... Okay, I know what the response is. It's going to be converge in the limit, blah, blah, blah. But that is exactly the point.
Almond's theorem, baby.
Yeah, we're never in the limit, and so we're never going to converge, and so you're just going to get random freaking numbers flying out at you.
In the limit, we're all dead, as John Maynard Keynes said to Hayek.
That's good.
It all links back together.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so anyway, just the fact that like we're claiming that super forecasting is super valuable, and then why isn't it being used by more organizations? So either you have to just say, okay, it's not that valuable such that organizations are not going out of their way to use it. That would be my claim. Or you have to, I don't know, you have to give some other reason why institutions aren't picking up on this. Maybe they're just scared of all the productivity gains they'd get, or governments are scared about how accurate their foreign policy is.
Or here's an even better question. Like, why the fuck is Tetlock trying to sell his product to companies when he could just be betting on the stock market?
yeah, sure. Like, why aren't all these people super rich?
Precisely. I think you made this point in a very succinct tweet, which is like, so all the super forecasters are really rich, right? No, it looks like they're making very desperate websites trying to get people to buy their product.
Okay, so some other points now. So I have 2 points to make. One, I just wanted to quote this paragraph from the piece I referenced earlier, discussing that Tetlock's earlier results were perhaps not as significant as he made them out to be. So this is a piece by Gavin Leach and Misha Yagudin, who were both very pro super forecasting, but just wanted to do a deep dive into the numbers because it seems like no one had actually done that since Tetlock's book himself. People kind of just took Tetlock's word at face value, as is kind of reasonable. So this is in an article for the Institute of Progress. And they're taking issue with the claim that super forecasters are 30% more accurate than expert political pundits. Okay. And quote, they say the following: the playing field is actually a bit more level than these eye-catching stats imply. A closer look at the 30% claim led to an unpublished study that indeed describes a 35% difference. But the paper's comparison between experts and super forecasters was not apples to apples. The aggregation method used for forecasters is known to produce better results than the one used for the expert analysts. A fair comparison found a 10% advantage for the amateurs, meaning the super forecasters, but not reaching statistical significance.
Well, and to add to this, so Tetlock's first half of his career is talking about how experts are worse than average. So what this is saying is that people are 10% better than people who are worse than average.
Worse than average, 10% worse than average?
Yeah,
wait a second.
So maybe you are like 52% compared to randomly flipping coins or something. But yeah, just to add that experts aren't better than average. Experts,
that's a great point.
Tetlock's own admission and study, like that was the first half of his work. So it's so interesting. If he stopped his legacy at like, you guys quit believing people who think they can predict the future, then he would go down in the annals of history as doing a great service. But instead he pivoted and he's like, well, actually there is a way to predict the future. And that's if you use Bayes. And then he just completely, like, everyone's forgotten about his first book in his first half of his career. It's very bizarre. You had 2 points you wanted to make, and I think I interrupted.
So the second one is slightly more technical. If it's too technical, we'll just cut this. But I'd like to get the intuition across somehow because I think it is important.
Yeah.
All the super forecasting stats, when they're computing these accuracies, these Brier scores, they are on average across a whole class of events. Okay. And so these are called marginal guarantees in statistics. And marginal guarantees are known to be quite weak. So here's an example. Going back to just like the predicting heads and tails, whether a coin will flip, 50%. So fair coin, 50% heads, 50% tails. If you predict 50% every time, you're going to be perfectly well calibrated.
Exactly.
Okay. But this tells you nothing about the next coin flip, right? And so this comes down to just like predicting the average of a distribution it's not an impressive task in some sense. Like just knowing about the mean of something is not impressive. This just comes down to the properties of means in some sense. And so there's a reason that like in machine learning, in statistics, very rarely people think about marginal guarantees. That's the first thing you try and do. And then as soon as you do that, which you typically can, you start thinking about what are called conditional guarantees. So conditional on like what's actually happening, some properties of the next observation you're seeing, then you try and say something about it. So to try and make this concrete with like the COVID epidemic, most of the time when you detect a new virus, it's not going to end up in a worldwide pandemic. Okay. So we detect something new in animals or even humans, something, right? We don't know what it is, but most of the time we don't end up in lockdown for a year. And so at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the super forecasters, I think on Metaculus, gave it like a 2% chance or 3% chance of becoming a worldwide pandemic. They were wrong about this in some sense, but they might have been right on average. If you look across all the times we detected some new virus, how many times has it become a pandemic? Yeah, probably something like 2% of the time. So in some sense, the super forecasters are very well calibrated. But for actually like making decisions about the future, you don't give a shit about the average case scenario. You want to say, okay, based like the fact
what do I do now? What do I do now?
Yeah, what do I do now? And you want the specifics of the case. So you want like it was discovered in Wuhan, it was all this stuff. And so if they had conditional Brier scores based on the features of the scenario at hand, and so we're making more than marginal predictions, and we're more than marginally calibrated, I would be way more impressed. But obviously, this is almost impossible to do because the future evolves and everything looks different over time and stuff. And so, yeah, hopefully that didn't become too technical, but I want to drill this distinction between just being correct on average and being correct for the next case. And those are hugely consequentially different for actually reasoning about the world and doing things and taking actions. But mathematically, you can say, oh, I'm well calibrated, even when you're totally wrong about the next thing that's coming down the pipeline.
100%. I mean, this just speaks to the usefulness of a lot of this stuff because, let's say I have just a very difficult business decision to make, and you bring in the world's leading super forecasters who are very, quote, well calibrated. They're going to say, yep, I don't know. Yep, I really don't know. 50%, don't know.
They'll just look at the base rates, right?
And I don't know. I don't know. And they'll be saying, I don't know, which, like we said earlier, is equivalent to saying 50% probability. And they'll get all the clout for being very well calibrated, while providing nothing of value whatsoever to the person who's hired them. And this is a point that I was trying to make in maybe less clear ways than you've just made it in my exchange with Mauricio, which is that like all these numbers don't factor in both the import of the prediction and like how much it frickin' matters or how difficult it is. Because if you have just a list of very challenging questions, and the true answer is 50 or coin flips across all of them, then you're going to walk out of there with a Tetlock patting you on the back saying, great job, you super forecaster, you, while having just basically said, don't know. And I think a lot of super forecasters are people who rightly say, I don't know more. And that is a valuable thing to have if you want to be humble and epistemically safe, I guess. Like, you don't want to be overly confident on stuff, but that's very different than knowing how to see into the future. So one of my main questions for Scott, if he ever listens to this, which I'm sure he won't, but here's an experiment I would love to see that he could run trivially tomorrow. And all he would do is say, okay, if you self-identify as a superforecaster, here's a list of 100 questions. I want all of you superforecasters to independently give me your probabilities. I'm not going to average them. I'm just going to show the variance. And I'm going to show the variance. And let's see how converged y'all think, you think you're converged, how converged you actually are. And I'm going to guess that there's going to be a pretty wide variance between the 60, 70, 80, 90% band. Meaning that once you eliminate the very easy questions and the very difficult questions, then you just pretty much have a bunch of random guesses. I don't know this for sure, but I know that like Scott is quote well calibrated because he runs these surveys all the time. But his claim is that any super forecaster will get the same numbers. He caveats that by saying in the limit, and mathematically that's true. But from a real like, what are we actually doing here, people perspective, we don't care about the limit. We care about like right now. Like, I want to see that Metaculus and all the top winners on Metaculus and Scott and the Sam Scardy Fardy people and the better judgment, the good judgment people, when they're given a question, they all independently will say 70% of the same question. I'm willing to bet that's not going to happen. And the reason I don't think that's going to happen is because Metaculus does aggregations, right? So if all the super forecasters are betting on the same thing, then there shouldn't be like a spread. It should just all be exactly the same number. And this, I think, gets closer to the main claims that Scott makes in this section, which is that he says that this number has some valuable properties. It's well calibrated. Okay, so if it's well calibrated, then independent super forecasters should all guess the same number. I claim that you're going to have a variance, and the variance is probably going to be like wide enough that that interesting band of where people quote are calibrated is going to be pretty spread. So if you're getting 70s, 60s, 80s, and 90s from people for a question that's actually 70, then when any one independent super forecaster comes and gives you their number, why should you trust that one any more than any other number that you could be given if you ask somebody else?